Wow, I'm going to stand up here. It's really bright up there. Because there's not that many people, I'm going to do this a little bit different. I don't have any slides, so we're going to have a little more, I don't know, more of a town hall type of discussion, I suppose. My background, just to give you a brief introduction, is I've been in games about 20 years, the last 10 of which have been in free-to-play across a number of different form factors. So I've done downloadable free-to-play MMOs, I did social games at a company called Playfish, and now mobile games at GREE. And so the topic that I came to talk to you about, I think is deceptively obvious and really important all at the same time, and I'll kind of get into why that is. And I'm walking out in the middle of you because I want to encourage you to interrupt me, ask questions, whatever. Like I said, I don't have any slides, so we can do whatever we want. But what I mean by this is, so there's a really basic aspect of free-to-play that it's kind of inherent to the business model. At the core of it, I think anybody who's spent a day here probably understands that it's really organized around arbitrage. So, the lifetime value of a customer should be more than the cost of getting that customer. And that's a really core and bedrock principle of free-to-play that affects pretty much the entire value chain all the way up and down. And so the idea of unlocking value with Eastern techniques in Western games simply comes from the idea that Asia's been at this a lot longer than those of us in the West. So if you look back at the history of free-to-play, like the very first free-to-play game that I'm aware of was done in Korea by Nexon. What was it called? Something about the Western winds. Does anybody know? Mark? No? No lifelong students of free-to-play. And so anyway, the point is that it's a very iterative and recursive business in that, the more cycles you have on the ball, the bigger advantage you have in terms of applying that forward. So, if you think about techniques like A/B testing and creating a knowledge base, it's very much a function of all of that in our experience anyway. And this topic came in a lot of ways from an inversion of a very old idea that actually came from Japan. There's a phrase in Japanese, wakon yosai, which, Tomoko, means what?
Say that again.
Wakon yosai.
It's the mix of Japanese way and mix the Japanese way and with Western way together.
That's pretty good. Tomoko's actually Japanese, so I shouldn't criticize her translation. Anyway, so it was a rallying cry in the Meiji era in Japan where they were bringing all kinds of Japanese technology and the kind of knowledge from outside the country and applying it to really a resurgence. And it translates in a lot of textbooks anyway as Japanese sensibility, Western technology or Western knowledge. So at GREE, when I first got there about 4 years ago, we inverted that. We kind of did Yokon Wasai, which would be basically the opposite, Japanese, methodology and Western gameplay. And that's really what I mean by this topic. We started doing that about 4 years ago. We breathed it through our company, we breathed it through our products, we breathed it through a relationship here in Vancouver actually with a company called Ayugo, which we have a publishing relationship with and we're an equity investor in. And what it was basically this concept that we have more cycles on the ball in Japan. GREE, for those of you who don't know, is a public company in Japan. We've been doing mobile games for about the last 10 years. And it had a platform of our own on mobile web. And so there's a history of free-to-play on mobile web that then translated to native game products. And so we took a lot of the methodology that I think is becoming more and more standard. People are more and more familiar with it now. Things that have to do with mechanics like gotcha, live ops, somebody mentioned, so events. But the detail of this stuff really matters in our experience. You get down into the detail of what is the right cadence for an event? in what territory, given the user base that you're targeting, like what is the curve that you need to have in a gotcha system in order for you to like hit the right notes for like drops, power up, et cetera. And so all of that stuff, from our perspective, is that knowledge, that technology that we then used in our IUGO relationship. We did some knowledge transfer to those guys in the early days, which we now see still paying dividends in their second game, actually with another partner, and that game is doing quite well. In addition to the first game that they did with us, which did quite well on the basis of that idea. We had an acquisition that we did this with. On my team, I do corporate development, so investments and acquisitions. We acquired a company in San Francisco called Funzio, and we 5x'd the run rate of that company from acquisition to basically the height. And it was really, this was at the center of it. The whole idea that there was a body of knowledge that we could transfer from Asia that needed to be harnessed inside Western gameplay. And so we continue to do that to this day. We look for Western development partners who are exceptional with regard to the games that they make and the willingness to adopt some of the methodology from Asia that we think is kind of primary. And it's really, like a driving force in everything we do, in fact. And so the idea that, we have single purpose, like kind of portfolios, we've never really been able to make that work for us. So we're not Supercell. We've never been able to like do one game and just pump it out globally. And we find that with the exception of a very rare group of content, like neither is anybody else. So what we do is we try and work with folks who we can, standardize around this methodology, which we consider to be, kind of more advanced in Asia, but basically true everywhere. But gameplay is super regional. Like people's tastes around artwork and people's tastes around the type of pacing that they enjoy and the type of games that they want to play is pretty local. Like I've spent years in another kind of job trying to get games into Japan, console games in that case, and it was really hard because I think, as a previous speaker has said, like that's a very distinct market, very regional tastes, and so for us, like this idea is super powerful in that it harnesses an idea that is essentially regional gameplay first, and then kind of best practice, free-to-play tactics, which happen to come from Asia throughout. And that's, like as I said, like it's a very bedrock principle for us, and we've seen huge success for us and our partners. In terms of it's made millions of dollars for us, it's made millions of dollars for them. And so when we interact with new folks, we tend to have a conversation that orients around this type of a thought process. And some people just get it naturally. They're like, why are you bothering to have a talk about that? That seems like super obvious. Everybody knows that. Then some people find it like fairly alien, and like they want to hear more. And so I don't know which group you guys are, but I'm totally happy to answer questions or talk this through, or make this into a better talk if it has sucked so far. So like tell me what you think. Like, is there something about this that you have that sparks your curiosity, or is this kind of obvious? Super obvious. Okay. So the interesting thing about this is I've seen it applied by other companies in different ways. So I talked to somebody recently from Warner who said that they had done a lot of partnerships with Western developers making Western product and then trying to export that to Asia. And they found that their brands actually weren't that powerful in those territories. If, these are things like, I would assume, I didn't get the details, but I assume it's things like, the DC universe and other characters that are built off movies that may or may not have done well in various Asian territories. Super interestingly now, they're actually making an effort to partner with Eastern developers first to primarily develop games based on their properties in Asia. And it's the same basic principle at work, where it's like the techniques used to make high monetizing games, which is important if you want to arbitrage LTV and CPI, are like very well practiced in those places. So you have, like in Korea, for example, the very first games that were built in free-to-play were done there. There are teams that are, like kind of 5th, 8th generation free-to-play teams, versus, like in San Francisco, where I'm from, like we're probably on, I would say, Gen 3. I would say the inception point in San Francisco was social games, and kind of Zynga was the face of all that. And that set of techniques and that history informs a lot of, like the follow-on generations. There's a different school, I would argue, that has kind of grown up in Korea and China, Japan to some degree, and then there's a whole different history in Europe where they had the kind of the browser game, particularly in Germany, the free-to-play browser games where, companies like BigPoint and GameForge. But each of these distinct regional interpretations basically follows the same business logic. It's really only the form factor that in the gameplay that really makes a difference in terms of what you see. But behind the scenes, the business aspect of it is super consistent, which I find fascinating because it's a new model in a lot of ways to audiences outside of Korea in particular, and it's tough to know what aspects of it are variable and what aspects of it are kind of permanent. And I would argue that a lot of the techniques, the really kind of nitty-gritty baseline techniques, are fairly consistent. You see them successful. So you look at Game of War, for example, which is a hit game from a Western developer. I would argue it's a Chinese game. I mean, a lot of the the techniques that you see in that game came directly from Chinese MMOs. I remember actually when they were developing that game, the CEO and I had a long chat about Chinese MMOs. He was probably one of the most astute students of Chinese MMOs that I've ever met. And you can see it in their games. They have really kind of dissected games from MMO developers like Giant, for example, and tried to learn best practice and put them into their games. And it has yielded probably the highest LTV Western game that there is, and then married it with super aggressive marketing techniques. So very powerful, very brute force interpretation of this idea happens to work very well. And there are other examples, but it's also why I think that you see more Asian content breakthrough in the West versus the other way around. So games like Summoner's War, Puzzles and Dragons, they have really strong kind of Eastern LTV mechanics at their core. And so there's an inherent kind of business advantage that they're tapping into, and then they can learn a little bit about the gameplay aspect, and not all these are successes, of course. Summoner's War, for example, super fresh for when it was introduced, but it is at its core super advanced in terms of the individual systems that it's employing and the way that it's taking advantage of all of this Eastern knowledge. Any questions yet?
I've got a question.
Sure.
I'll help you out there.
That's awesome. No, otherwise it's going to be a really short talk.
Yeah, I know. So if I can paraphrase, obviously you're saying that which is kind of what I was suggesting before in an earlier panel, that the Asian business models are an advance of the Western business model because they've been doing free to play for longer. Yeah, that's the basis. So my question is, what do you need to change then? Because obviously you can't. One thing I would challenge is whether those Asian games have hit in the West. My understanding, I'm observing the business rather than being at the sharp end of it, is that they've struggled, and so that at the moment it seems to be a wave of Asian businesses investing in Western studios because it's been quite hard to just step and repeat. And not that it's easy the other way either, but
no, there's a lot of truth to that. I think it's both depending on kind of how deeply you measure what. So I think it's quite fair to say that Summoner's War is a success. I think it's quite fair to say Puzzles and Dragons is a success, but on a smaller scale than it was in its native market in Japan. So there are, Brave Frontier was a strong success for a time, even in a variety of Western markets. But there are, for every one of those, there are just as many kind of also ran games that didn't make it. And I think that's kind of the truth of your point, is that there is only so much truly Eastern content that can kind of penetrate. So the business model, having an advantage there, that's great. But the reason that you see Eastern companies partnering with Western developers is, as I say, the same reason that we did. So as a Japanese company, we have a lot of knowledge around what makes a game high LTV, and what are the techniques necessary to do that, what are the systems necessary to do that, how do you kind of orchestrate a 5-year kind of growth curve for a game, which is what we kind of expect on mobile these days. And then, making that a really enjoyable experience on a day-to-day basis for like a Western player base, that's the chocolate and peanut butter.
Yeah.
So it's the combination that is kind of magical, and it is, I think, useful for like folks who are not kind of deeply kind of steeped in free-to-play methodology to play games that are uncomfortable for them.
Yeah.
Play games that like kind of violate their sensibilities, right? It's like, oh
Like
my
Game of
God,
War.
this game is in my pocket. It's trying to like steal money from me. I can just feel it. You should play that game.
Yeah.
You should understand that game. You should really I mean, if you're a game designer in particular, you should understand why that works, even though it kind of violates your basic sensibilities about what a game is.
But what would you say Game of War, I mean, like, obviously Machines have been phenomenally successful, and it's really interesting. I hadn't really thought, it is quite a different game to a lot of Western games already. So what have they changed? What is it about? Is it that they've put Schwarzenegger and Kate had,
So, I mean, I think it's a case study if you want to like kind of dig into that.
Yeah, I was just
but I mean, at a
chatting.
high level, we can just kind of throw some stuff out. I mean, I crowdsourced some stuff. I think you in particular would probably have some ideas, so don't leave me hanging. But I think at a high level, the overwhelming driver in that game is that it is a very, very, very heavily oriented around competition. And if you are not a competitive person, you pretty much burn off immediately. So they're not interested in the puzzle player. They're not interested in kind of the player who is not going to very quickly want to spend money on competing with other people.
Yeah.
So it ramps incredibly steep. And again, this is what I'm saying. Like that violates a lot of the key principles that like as a console kind of game developer, I used to think were normal. I mean, I used to aspire to the Nintendo ramp, which is a lot more gradual, a lot more fun, and a lot more, just it meets what I think a game is. On the other hand, that game's #1 in the App Store. So.
No, yeah, there's no denying it's success. It's just I'm just trying to interesting what they changed. That's the bit I'm trying to. I mean, if we all knew that, then obviously I'm sure we'd all be.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a lot of detail to go in and understand. But I mean, like at its core, it's heavy PvP, and then there's like a lot of systems that underlie it. And I think that's the key thing that you realize if you play these games kind of aggressively and play as a committed player, is that the systems interlock and they kind of continue to encourage you to progress. So like competition and progression are at the core of a lot of high LTV games. They're not the only way to do it, by the way. I mean, like I think the great alternate pole is Supercell. Yeah. So Supercell, has finished game sensibilities and very light monetization. Those are not techniques that they have adopted from, that they're not following this model. They're following something else, and that's awesome. That there are more than one success pattern. But I think the success pattern that gets missed, particularly by folks who are less familiar with free-to-play, is that it is a very specific kind of set of kind of techniques and circumstances that you can employ, and a lot of them have been honed over 20 years worth of free-to-play in Korea and China. And so it is an old body of work in a lot of ways, and it is very knowable if you kind of commit to playing games that make you very uncomfortable.
Was there resistance in Asia to free-to-play? Like, did it take time? Were we just playing the catch-up game, or was it cultural?
No, I think there's less resistance primarily because there's less of a console business. There's probably more resistance in Japan because it has a very long console kind of history, but Korea and China in particular didn't have a console history. And in China, I mean, I'm not an expert in China by any stretch, but my personal experience is that entertainment there was, kind of consumed in such a way that made this a more natural step. And so, I think where we have to unclimb a lot of mountains in order to get there, like in the United States, in Europe, in Canada, I think there's fewer mountains to that particular leap in, like certain Asian territories. Japan, interestingly, has a very deep, kind of console history. A lot of the console manufacturers, in fact, come from Japan. That said, as kind of free-to-play came on PC, like it didn't take off that quickly, but primarily because Japan isn't a PC country. As it made the morph to mobile, it took off like wildfire, as it did here, arguably. I mean, there are generations now of game players who think that that's how games are played. So like my generation grew up thinking that games were played in an arcade, that you pay quarter by quarter, and then we got console and we thought that was great because we didn't have to like bother with quarters anymore. But it describes a curve of how you think a game is supposed to be consumed and what's fair to you and what's enjoyable to you, and I think it has an effect. So like understanding the core economics and understanding the business case is tightly coupled, in my opinion anyway, with the design and like how you think about fun. And it's a very, I would say, hotly discussed topic in certain Western circles. I don't think it's at all discussed in a lot of Asian game design circles. It's kind of course. And I'm running out of time. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Do you find, and when you're employing this methodology to say when the Funzio acquisition completed, was there either a conscious or a sort of subconscious resistance to kind of accepting it? And if there was, do you think that over time now you've developed a kind of a delivery methodology of helping people understand the method? Or?
There was not. And the reason there was not, it was one of the primary kind of very clear drivers of the deal. So the founders of that company understood that like there was this kind of opportunity that we were missing. In fact, we, myself and one other person, kind of in our early conversations with them, shared a couple like kind of very tactical tidbits, and we're like, like this is real. Here, try this. They came back about I think 3 weeks later saying like, hey, that added $1 million worth of revenue at our run rate on that game. You guys clearly are not, kind of blowing smoke at us. And then as the deal went through and we began to work more closely together, it took, I would say, 6 months before it really caught a gear. But once it did, the results were pretty dramatic. And those were old games that were never designed to do that. So like in the case of other partnerships that we've had, we have been more proactive. I mean, none of this is as clean as I'm making it sound, to be transparent. I mean, there's a lot of stuff left on the cutting room floor. But in the end, I mean, if you kind of keep your eye on the ball, like there is like a very clear correlation between certain kind of key systems and certain business outcomes, and then it just becomes a matter of like trying those ideas in this game and seeing if they actually fit and what results they produce. In that particular case, like we had the right idea going in. I think we got lucky, and like a couple things clicked into place, and like we had great results as a kind of a function of that. But it wasn't, it wasn't like, oh yeah, this is clearly going to the moon. And the founder of Machine Zone, in talking to him about it, I understood exactly what his plan was. It was super brute force, super obvious, very clear, kind of extension of all of these ideas. And like I had trouble convincing other people in my kind of direct circle of friends / business colleagues that was going to produce any results. Everybody was like, that's going to produce a terrible game. And like my opinion at the time was like, I don't know, it's going to be binary. It's going to be a huge smoking crater, or it's going to be top of the charts. Turned out to be top of the charts. But I don't think it's always like cut and dry. But I would say like there's power in there. And there are lots of examples of it now. I mean, at the time we weren't so sure, but now we're super confident of it.